They called it mercy when they bound her to the mast, a final kindness before casting her into the storm-wracked seas. The shieldmaiden's fate was sealed by trembling hands and fearful hearts, her sacrifice deemed necessary to appease the gods' wrath. As lightning split the heavens and waves crashed against the longship's hull, she did not beg. She smiled, for in the depths below, something ancient stirred, something that had slumbered since the time of Jörmungandr himself. While the warriors wept and turned away, none witnessed the glint in her eyes, the look of one who knew that chains meant for sacrifice could become reins of power. Through the tempest's fury, her laughter carried like thunder. What secrets did she discover in those dark waters that turned a sacrifice into a conquest? Before we dive deeper into this tale, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story calls to you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The broken war horn lay silent in Astrid's calloused hands, its ancient ivory surface scarred from the blade that had split it during her first battle. 10 winters had passed since that day, yet she could still feel the weight of her father's disappointment when she chose the sword over the spindle. The horn's jagged edge caught the firelight, casting strange shadows across the walls of her quarters aboard the flagship of the Northern Fleet. Outside, the sea churned with an unnatural fury, the kind of storm that made even hardened warriors whisper prayers to gods they claimed not to believe in anymore. Astrid traced the runes carved into the horn's base, protection sigils her grandmother had etched there when she was just a child. The old ways endure, the ancient woman had told her, even when men forget them. She remembered the day she earned her place among the shield wall, not through beauty or birth, but through the kind of courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. The raid had gone wrong, as raids sometimes did, and the enemy had broken through their lines. The warriors, her father's chosen men, had faltered, but Astrid hadn't. When their war horn bearer fell, she had snatched up the horn and sounded the rally cry. Even as an enemy's blade cleaved the instrument in two, the sound that emerged was terrible and beautiful, a broken note that somehow carried across the battlefield like the shriek of a Valkyrie. They spoke of that day still, in hushed tones around the feast fires, how a maiden barely past her 16th winter had turned the tide of battle with nothing but a broken horn and a borrowed sword. Some said it was the god's will, others whispered darker things, that she had made pacts with creatures best left unnamed. The truth was both simpler and more complex. Astrid had simply been tired of waiting for permission to be what she already was. Rising from her seat, she moved to the small window of her cabin, watching lightning dance across the waves. The fleets, 5 remaining longships, fought against winds that seemed to have a mind of their own. This storm wasn't natural. Anyone with sea sense could tell that much. It had followed them for 3 days, picking off their ships one by one, playing with them like a cat with wounded mice. Below deck, she could hear the crew muttering about signs and portents, about the need for sacrifice to appease whatever power they had offended. Astrid's hand tightened around the broken horn. She knew how these stories usually ended, had known, perhaps, since the moment the storm first appeared on their horizon. The old songs were clear about such things. When the gods demanded payment, they rarely settled for sheep or cattle. They hungered for nobler offerings, and who nobler than the woman who had defied tradition? The warrior who had dared to step beyond her appointed place. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter!" she called, though she already knew. What news awaited her? Bjorn Whitehair, her father's most trusted advisor, stood in the doorway. His face was grave in the flickering lamplight. "The council has convened," he said softly. "They request your presence." Astrid nodded, slipping the broken horn into her belt. She had known this moment would come, had felt its approach in her bones, like the onset of winter. But knowing the blade will fall doesn't make its edge any less sharp. "Tell them I'll be there shortly," she replied, her voice steady. "I need a moment to prepare myself." After Bjorn left, Astrid took one last look at her reflection in the polished shield mounted on her wall. The woman who stared back was not beautiful in the traditional sense. Her face was too angular, marked by a scar that ran from temple to jaw, another gift from that first battle. But there was something in her eyes, a fierce intelligence that even her critics couldn't deny. She straightened her leather armor, checking the bindings one last time. If she was to face judgment, she would do so as a warrior, not a supplicant. The broken horn bumped against her hip as she moved, a reminder of all she had fought to become. The storm's fury seemed to increase. With each step, she took toward the council chamber, as if it too knew what was coming. But Astrid Stormborn had never been one to let fear guide her path. She had defied tradition once before and survived. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through. That first battle, besides, she thought with a grim smile, storms had a way of changing things, of breaking what was rigid and washing away what was rotten. Perhaps this one would prove no different. Sigrid the Seer's gnarled fingers moved across the elder bone runes with practiced reverence. Each yellowed piece, carved from the bones of the first settlers to die on these waters, clicked against the others with sounds like distant thunder. The old woman's blind eyes, white as sea foam, stared at nothing and everything as she cast the runes across the worn table in the council chamber. "The signs are clear," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Something stirs. In the deep, something that remembers the old bargains." Around the table, the fleet's leaders shifted uncomfortably. These were hard men, veterans of 100 raids, but there was something in the air that made them feel like children again, huddled around grandmother's hearth while she told tales of the things that hunted in the dark waters. The runes had been casting badly for days now, each reading darker than the last. First, the serpent rune had appeared, always inverted, speaking of great powers disturbed. Then, the sacrifice rune, again and again, no matter how many times they cast. And always, the crown rune lay shattered, split by the rune of storms. Astrid watched from her position near the door, noting how the mighty Jarls flinched at each click of bone against bone. She had never put much stock in the runes herself. Her grandmother had taught her that destiny was written in deeds, not divination. But even she couldn't deny the wrongness that pervaded the air. The sea itself had changed. The waters had turned a deep, unnatural purple-black, like a bruise spreading across the world. Fish floated dead in their wake, their bodies twisted, as if they died fleeing from something in the depths. At night, strange lights danced beneath the waves, and sounds that should not exist at sea echoed across the water. Sounds like vast things moving, like ancient stones grinding against each other in the deep. 3 ships lost, Harold Blackbeard growled, his massive fist clenching on the table. 3 ships in as many days, and not a splinter found of any of them. No bodies, no debris, just gone, as if the sea itself swallowed them whole. "The gods are angry," Sigrid intoned, her fingers never ceasing their movement across the bones. "We have strayed too far from the old ways, ventured into waters that were forbidden to our ancestors, and now," she paused, head tilted as if listening to voices only she could hear, "now the bill comes due." Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the chamber in harsh white light. In that instant, Astrid saw something that made her blood run cold. The shadows cast by the bone runes on the table weren't the shapes of the runes themselves. Instead, they formed the image of a woman bound to a mast, while beneath her, something vast and serpentine coiled through dark waters. The vision lasted only a moment, but she wasn't the only one who saw it. A collective gasp went up from the assembled leaders, followed by a heavy silence broken only by the ongoing storm. "Tell us plainly, seer," Eric Redax demanded, though his voice trembled slightly. "What do the runes say? What must we do to survive this curse?" Sigrid gathered the bones slowly, cradling them like precious children. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming deeper, older, as if multiple voices spoke through her at once. "The old powers hunger," she said. "They remember when we gave them their due, when we honored the ancient pacts made in blood and bone. They remember, and they demand what is owed. "Speak clearly, woman," Harold shouted, but there was fear behind his bluster. "What sacrifice will appease them?" The blind seer turned her milk-white eyes toward Astrid, and though she couldn't possibly see, her gaze fixed upon her with unerring accuracy. "They demand nobility," she said. "They demand strength. They demand one who has already broken with tradition, who stands between the old ways and the new, one who carries the blood of the first settlers in her veins." The chamber fell silent as every eye turned to Astrid. She felt the weight of their stares, heavy as chainmail. In that moment, she understood with perfect clarity what her grandmother had meant about destiny. Sometimes it wasn't written in the runes at all, but in the fears and desperation of men. "The storm will not abate," Sigrid continued, her voice now barely a whisper. "The depths will not be satisfied, not until they receive their due. With each passing hour their hunger grows. With each ship lost, their patience wanes. Choose quickly, or choose to die slowly. Those are the only choices left." As if to punctuate her words, a wave crashed against the ship, with enough force to send several of the yarls staggering. The timbers groaned in protest, and somewhere below decks, a beam cracked with a sound like breaking bones. Astrid's hand found the broken warhorn at her belt, fingers tracing its familiar edges. She thought of all the battles she had fought to earn her place, all the traditions she had defied. Perhaps this was always where that path led, not to glory in battle, but to a different kind of end, a different kind of victory. Before anyone could speak, she stepped forward. "If sacrifice is needed," she said, her voice clear and strong, above the storm's fury, "then let it be my choice to make, not yours to demand." The seer smiled, a terrible expression on her ancient face. "The runes speak true," she said. "The worthy one chooses herself." She reached into her robes and withdrew a single bone rune, passing it to Astrid with trembling fingers. "Take it," she whispered. "Where you are going, you may need to cast your own fate." Astrid accepted the rune, feeling its cold weight in her palm. It was the journey rune, she noticed. The one that spoke not of endings, but of transformations, of paths that led through darkness into unknown lights. Outside, the storm howled louder, as if recognizing that its demand would soon be met. But, beneath its fury, Astrid thought she heard something else, a deeper sound, like vast coils moving through darker waters, like ancient things stirring from longer sleeps. She closed her fingers around the rune, feeling its edges bite into her palm. Whatever waited in the depths, she would meet it as she had met every other challenge, on her own terms, with courage in her heart and steel in her spine. The council chamber had fallen silent, but the silence spoke volumes. The decision had been made, though no vote had been taken. The sacrifice had chosen herself, and in doing so had given them the only thing they could accept. A way to believe this was justice rather than murder. The chieftain's bronze crown sat heavy on Harold Blackbeard's brow as he called the formal council to order. Ancient and unadorned, save for worn runes of authority, it had witnessed 3 centuries of difficult decisions, but never one quite like this. The crown's weight seemed to increase with each passing moment, as if the responsibility it represented was becoming a physical burden. "We gather," Harold's voice echoed through the chamber, "to decide what must be done to save our fleet and our people." His fingers traced the crown's edge unconsciously, a nervous gesture that betrayed his discomfort. "The gods demand sacrifice, and a volunteer stands before us." Astrid stood in the center of the chamber, her back straight, her eyes forward. She had changed into her full battle regalia, polished leather armor, sword at her hip, the broken warhorn still secured at her belt. If this was to be her last council, she would face it as a warrior, not a victim. Eric Redax was the first to speak against it. "This is madness," he growled, rising from his seat. "We cannot sacrifice one of our own. Astrid is a warrior, a leader. Her blood has bought victories for this fleet." "Her blood might buy us survival now," Bjorn Whitehair countered softly. The old advisor's face was drawn with grief, but his voice remained steady. "The signs cannot be ignored. 3 ships lost. The sea itself turns against us. If we do nothing, we all die." Lightning illuminated the chamber through its high windows, casting harsh shadows across worried faces. The storm's fury had only increased since the reading of the runes, as if nature itself was demanding they hurry with their decision. "There must be another way," Eric insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. They had already tried everything else. Sacrifice their finest livestock, offered up their treasures to the depths. Nothing had appeased the darkness that haunted their wake. Harold removed the crown, placing it on the council table with deliberate care. In the stuttering lamplight, the bronze seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. "Astrid Stormborn," he spoke her name formally. "You have heard the seer's words. You understand what is being asked?" "I do." Her voice carried clearly without tremor or doubt. "My life in exchange for the fleet's survival. My blood to calm the storms and satisfy the old powers. And you offer this freely?" A hint of a smile touched her scarred face. "Nothing about." "This is free, Harold Blackbeard, but I choose it, yes. Better a sacrifice made willingly than one taken by force." The crown seemed to dim slightly, as if responding to her words. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They all knew the old stories. Willing sacrifices often held more power than those given under duress. Sometimes they changed the very nature of the offering. Sigrid the seer stirred. In her corner, her blind eyes fixing on the crown. "The old powers recognize nobility," she whispered. "They respect strength freely given more than weakness taken by force. But they also demand ceremony. Tradition. The sacrifice must be made properly, or it will mean nothing." "Then let us do this properly," Astrid said, stepping forward to place her hand on the crown. The metal was warm beneath her fingers, almost fevered. "Let us make this a warrior's offering, not a maiden's death." The gesture silenced the chamber. By touching the crown, she had invoked ancient law, the right of a warrior to choose the manner of their sacrifice. None could deny her this. Not without breaking traditions far older than their current fears. Harold's face showed a mixture of respect and resignation. "Speak your terms, Astrid Stormborn. I will go to the depths armed and armored, as befits a warrior. I will be bound to the mast with my weapons at hand, facing the storm that claims me. And I will go at midnight, when the veil between worlds is thinnest." Her voice took on a formal cadence, as if she were reciting terms of battle. "In return, I demand the fleet hold position until dawn. If the storms cease with my sacrifice, you sail on to victory. If they do not—" She paused, meeting each council member's eyes in turn. "Then you'll know the gods demanded a different price, and you can choose your next offering more wisely." The logic was impeccable, the terms both fair and strategically sound. One by one, the council members nodded their agreement. Even Eric Redax, who had argued most strongly against the sacrifice, gave his assent with obvious respect. Harold reached for the crown, but Astrid's hand stopped him. "One more thing," she said quietly. "If I do not return by dawn, my bones become the property of the seer. Let her cast them with the others, so some part of me might still serve the fleet." Sigrid cackled softly from her corner, a knowing sound that raised the hair on many necks. "Clever girl," she whispered. "Clever, clever girl." Harold nodded slowly, lifting the crown. Its weight seemed to have changed again, becoming something more complex than simple responsibility. "So be it," he declared. "Let it be recorded that Astrid Stormborn chose a warrior's sacrifice, freely and with full knowledge of her fate. Let it be known that she goes to the depths with honor, carrying the hopes and prayers of the fleet." As if responding to his words, the storm's fury briefly abated, the silence spreading across the waves like a held breath. In that moment of quiet, Astrid thought she heard something else, a deep sound, more felt than heard, like vast coils moving through darker waters, like ancient things stirring from longer sleeps. The council dispersed quickly after that, none wanting to meet her eyes for too long. Only Sigrid remained, her ancient fingers still moving across her bone runes. "The crown grows heavy with the weight of decisions," the old woman observed. But sometimes, child, chains can weigh more than crowns. And sometimes, she smiled her terrible smile, sometimes chains can become crowns if one is clever enough to turn them. Astrid touched the broken war horn at her belt, then the single bone rune the seer had given her. "We shall see," she said softly. "We shall see what the depths have to say about clever girls and ancient bargains." Outside, the storm gathered its strength once more, as if preparing for the midnight hour. But beneath its fury, that deeper sound continued, growing stronger with each passing moment, like something vast and ancient, stirring from centuries of slumber, reaching up through dark waters toward a promise written in blood and bone. The storm-forged pendant hung cold against Astrid's chest, its metal seeming to pulse with each crash of thunder overhead. The artifact had been a gift from Sigrid just moments before, pressed into her palm with trembling fingers. "Forged in lightning, quenched in the tears of the sea," the old seer had whispered. "It will show you the way when darkness is all there is." Now, as midnight approached, Astrid stood before the mainmast, her armor gleaming dully in the storm-broken darkness. The crew worked quickly, securing her bonds with a mixture of reverence and fear. These were not simple ropes, but ancient chains, marked with runes of binding and offering. Each link had been forged in sacred fires and cooled in sacrificial blood, or so the stories claimed. The pendant grew colder with each chain secured, until it felt like a piece of winter pressed against. Her skin, strange, how it seemed to grow heavier as they bound her, as if it were gathering weight from the very air around them. "The chains are secured," Harold announced, his voice barely carrying above the wind. He wouldn't meet her eyes as he stepped. Back, the chieftain's crown now seeming to weigh his head down. "Do you wish to speak any final words?" Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in harsh relief. The entire crew had gathered, their faces pale and drawn in the ethereal light. Even Eric Redax, who had argued so strongly against this, stood silent now, his mighty axe lowered in respect. "I speak no final words," Astrid replied, her voice steady despite the chain's bite. "Final words are for those who believe in endings. I prefer to think of this as a negotiation." A nervous murmur ran through the assembled warriors. Somewhere, in the darkness, she heard Sigrid's dry chuckle. The old woman understood, even if the others didn't. This was more than sacrifice, it was transformation. The pendant pulsed once, sharply, as if in agreement. Beneath the waves, that deep sound she'd been hearing grew stronger. No longer just a feeling, but a presence, vast and ancient, stirring in the depths below. "Prepare to lower the mast!" Harold's command cut through the night. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, though their hands shook as they worked the ropes. This was an old ceremony, one they'd learned but never expected to perform. Lower the sacrifice into the storm waters. Let the sea take what it demanded. As the mast began to tilt, Astrid felt the first real stirring of fear, not of death. She'd made peace with that possibility long ago. No, this was the fear of transformation, of becoming something other than what she'd always been. The pendant grew colder still, until it felt like it was burning with ice against her skin. The storm's fury increased as the mast lowered, waves crashing against the ship's hull with renewed violence. Lightning danced across the water in impossible patterns, illuminating shapes beneath the surface that should not exist. Vast coils of darkness moved through deeper darkness, while ancient eyes opened in the depths below. "Hold fast!" Harold's voice cracked with strain as a particularly massive wave struck the ship. "Lower her steadily!" Astrid watched the dark waters rise to meet her, or perhaps she was descending to meet them. The pendant's cold had spread through her entire body now, making her flesh tingle with strange energies. Each breath brought the scent of salt and lightning, of ancient things stirring from longer sleeps. The first touch of the sea was like an electric shock, sending currents of power through her body. The chains seemed to sing, their runes glowing, with an inner light that pulsed in time with the pendant's rhythm. This was no natural storm, she realized with sudden clarity. This was something older, something that remembered when the world was younger and darker and filled with deeper magics. As the waters rose to her waist, she heard voices in the storm. Not the shouts of the crew above, but older voices, speaking in tongues that hadn't been heard in the world of men for centuries. They spoke of bargains and transformations, of power and price, of chains that could become crowns if worn with the right understanding. The pendant flared suddenly, its cold fire spreading through her body like frozen lightning. In that moment, Astrid saw through the dark waters with perfect clarity, saw the vast shape moving below, larger than any creature she'd ever imagined could exist, saw ancient eyes opening, fixing upon her with a gaze that held centuries of slumber and hunger. "I come to negotiate," she shouted into the storm, her voice carrying with supernatural power. The pendant amplified her words, sending them through water and wind to reach whatever waited below. Not as victim, but as warrior. Not as sacrifice, but as equal. The waters reached her chest, then her throat. The chain's song grew stronger, harmonizing with that deep sound from below. The pendant's power spread through her entire body now, making her flesh transparent, showing her bones glowing with inner fire. Above, she heard the crew's shocked cries as her transformation became visible to them. Her skin had begun to shine with an inner light, while her eyes reflected the ancient power stirring in the depths. This was what Sigrid had seen, she realized. Not just sacrifice, but apotheosis. The last thing she heard before the waters closed over her head was the old seer's voice, carried to her ears alone. "Remember, clever girl, the oldest magics require willing sacrifice, but they never specify what happens after." Then she was fully submerged, the dark waters embracing her like a lover. The pendant's power kept her conscious, kept her aware as she sank deeper into the abyss. The chains no longer felt like bonds, but like connections, linking her to something vast and powerful and ancient. Through waters black as night and cold. As death, Astrid descended, but with each fathom the pendant's light grew stronger, illuminating a path through the darkness, towards something that had waited centuries for exactly this moment, exactly this offering, exactly this transformation. The broken war horn at her belt vibrated with power, while the bone rune in her pouch seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. All the pieces were in place, all the ancient tools gathered. Now it was time to see what clever girls could do with chains and crowns and sacrifices freely given. In the depths below, something vast and ancient stirred and smiled. The darkness should have been absolute at this depth, but the storm-forged pendant's glow created a sphere of pale light around Astrid as she descended. The chains that had bound her to the mast now floated around her like strands of seaweed, no longer restraining, but somehow weighting. Through water that should have crushed her, she sank deeper, guided by currents that felt more like hands. The natural forces. Then she saw it, a scale larger than a warrior's shield, its surface a maze of intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as she watched. It floated before her in the darkness, pulsing with its own inner light. Even before her fingers touched it, she knew what it was. A scale of Jörmungandr, shed from the world serpent itself in ages past. As her hand closed around the scale's edge, knowledge flooded through her mind. Not in words, but in images and sensations. Vast creatures moving through darker waters, songs that could shake the foundations of the earth, powers that had slumbered. Since the world was young, the scale wasn't just a remnant of a legendary creature. It was a key to understanding their language, their thoughts, their very nature. A sound like mountains grinding together reverberated through the depths. The Leviathan emerged from the darkness with terrible grace, its body so vast that even the pendant's light couldn't illuminate all of it at once. Coils larger than her longship moved through the water with fluid precision, while ancient eyes, the size of shield walls, fixed upon her with terrible intelligence. "You come before us in chains." The creature's thoughts resonated directly in her mind, translated by the scale's power. "Yet you wear them like armor, rather than bonds. Interesting. Astrid felt no fear as she faced the ancient being. The scales, power let her see the Leviathan as it truly was, not just a monster from the depths, but a creature of profound complexity and ancient wisdom. "I come as I am," she replied, her thoughts carried through the water by the scales' magic, a warrior seeking knowledge rather than a victim awaiting death. The massive head moved closer, each scale on its surface intricate enough to contain entire sagas written in a language older than human speech. "Many have been sacrificed to us over the centuries," it communicated. "They came wrapped in prayers and pleading, offering their deaths to appease our hunger. But you," a sound like distant thunder rolled through the depths, "you offer transformation instead of ending. You seek to understand rather than simply submit." The chains around Astrid moved with sudden purpose, wrapping around her arms and legs in patterns that matched the runes inscribed on the great scale. The pendant flared brighter, its light now tinged with the same shifting colors that played across the Leviathan scales. The old ones taught that sacrifice was about loss. She projected her thoughts clearly. But the oldest stories speak of sacrifice as transformation, of offering one thing to become another. She held up the scale, watching as its patterns aligned with similar markings on the creature's vast body. "I offer my old self freely, but I choose what I become." Laughter like earthquakes rumbled through the water. "Clever indeed. You understand what so many have forgotten. The ancient powers don't hunger for death, we hunger for change, for those willing to transform themselves through understanding rather than break themselves through fear." More of the massive creature's body emerged from the darkness, coiling around her in a spiral that stretched up toward the distant surface and down into unimaginable depths. Each scale contained its own light now, creating a lattice of power that turned the ocean itself into a vast, living temple. "We have waited centuries for one who would understand this," the Leviathan communicated. "The others who were sacrificed came seeking either salvation or death. You come seeking wisdom. That makes all the difference." The chains around Astrid began to glow with the same light that filled the creature's scales, their runes transforming. From symbols of binding to marks of connection, the pendant at her chest pulsed in harmony with this new power, while the broken war horn at her belt hummed with energies older than human memory. "There is a price," the ancient being warned. "To understand our ways is to become something other than human. To speak our language is to transform yourself into something that bridges two worlds." Astrid smiled, holding the scale before her like a shield. "I crossed that bridge the moment I chose to be a warrior rather than what tradition demanded. I've never been fully part of their world anyway." The Leviathan's massive eye studied her with an intelligence that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. "Then let us teach you our songs," it decided. "Let us show you how to speak with the voice of storms and depths. Let us transform those chains of sacrifice into bonds of power." The scale in Astrid's hands grew warm, its patterns flowing like liquid metal. The chains around her body moved with new purpose, weaving themselves into armor that gleamed with abyssal light. The pendant's power spread through her entire being, reshaping her understanding of what was possible. "Your people above wait to see if their sacrifice will calm the storms," the creature observed. "Shall we show them what true power looks like? Shall we teach them the difference between appeasing ancient forces and becoming one with them?" Astrid felt the truth of transformation moving through her body like lightning through water. The scale's power had become part of her now, letting her sense every massive creature stirring in the depths around them. She could feel their thoughts, their powers, their ancient hunger for recognition rather than mere sacrifice. "Yes," she replied, her mind's voice now carrying harmonics that could shake the foundations of the sea itself. "Let's show them what happens when sacrifice becomes partnership, when chains become connections, when death becomes transformation." The Leviathan's laughter shook the ocean floor. Above, the storm raged with renewed purpose, no longer random fury but concentrated power. And in the depths below, Astrid began to learn the songs that could command the seas themselves. Songs written in scales and storms, in sacrifice and transformation, in the spaces between what she had been and what she was becoming. In the abyssal darkness, ancient ruins rose like the bones of forgotten gods. Structures that had never been meant for human eyes stretched toward the surface, their surfaces encrusted with coral that glowed with its own inner light. The Leviathan guided Astrid through this sunken city, its massive coils moving with surprising delicacy between towers that had stood since before the first Norse ships sailed these waters. Here, the creature's thoughts resonated through the scale of Jörmungandr. This is where the Old Ones ruled, before the waters claimed their realm. At the heart of the ruins stood a temple, its architecture both familiar and alien, carved. Serpents wrapped around columns of black stone, their eyes set with pearls that still gleamed after centuries underwater. And there, suspended in a shaft of light created by the storm-forged pendant, floated what Astrid first took to be another coral formation. The coral crown, the Leviathan explained as she reached for it, formed from the bones of the first. Sea kings, grown in the depths where transformation is law rather than possibility. The crown settled onto her brow with the weight of centuries. Immediately Astrid felt new awareness flood through her mind. She could sense every creature within leagues, from the smallest fish to the largest denizens of the deep. Their thoughts, their movements, their very essence became as clear to her as her own heartbeat. The crown binds you to the sea itself, the ancient being told her. Not as ruler, but as interpreter, one who understands both worlds and can bridge their boundaries. Astrid flexed her newfound awareness, testing its limits. Schools of fish responded to her thoughts, moving in complex patterns through the water. Deeper creatures stirred in their trenches, acknowledging her presence with ancestral memories of when humans and sea beings had once worked together. "Show me more," she commanded, her mental voice carrying harmonics that made the coral structures resonate. "Show me how to master these powers." The Leviathan's approval rumbled through the water. Over what might have been hours or days, time moved differently in the depths. It taught her the old ways, how to sing the songs that could calm storms or raise them, how to speak with the voice of the depths, how to command not through force but through understanding. The chains that had bound her, now transformed by ancient magic, wrapped around her arms and legs in patterns that matched the coral formations. Each link hummed with power, connecting her more deeply to the ocean's mysteries. The broken war horn at her belt had changed too, its surface now covered in growing coral that enhanced its power rather than marking its damage. But there is more here than just power, the Leviathan cautioned as Astrid practiced her new abilities. These ruins hold memories of why the alliance between surface and depths was broken, of why we retreated into legend while humans forgot the old partnerships. Moving through the sunken city, Astrid saw scenes played out in coral and current, memories preserved by the sea itself. She witnessed great battles between ships and serpents, saw how fear and greed had poisoned ancient bonds of trust. The coral crown showed her how humans had tried to dominate rather than cooperate, how they had forgotten that true power came from understanding rather than control. "Your people above still think in terms of conquest," the creature observed. "They sacrifice to appease us, never understanding that we don't want their deaths. We want their wisdom, their partnership, their willingness to learn the deeper songs." Astrid swam to what had once been the temple's highest tower. From here, she could sense the fleet above, still holding position as they waited to see if their sacrifice had appeased the storm. She could feel their fear, their uncertainty, their desperate hope that her death would buy them safety. "They're about to learn a different lesson," she said, the coral crown glowing brighter with her resolve. About the difference between power taken and power earned, about what happens when sacrifice leads to understanding rather than ending. The Leviathan's massive form coiled around the tower, its scales reflecting the crown's light in patterns that made the water itself seem to dance. And what of the enemy fleet approaching from the north, the ones who think to take advantage of your people's weakness? Astrid smiled, feeling the weight of the crown settle more firmly on her brow. Through its power, she could sense them too, dozens of ships cutting through dark waters, their crews confident in their coming victory. They had no idea what awaited them in the depths. They'll serve as our demonstration, she decided, a lesson in what happens when the old powers wake and choose new partners rather than new victims. She raised her hands, and the chains around her arms sang with power. Throughout the ruins, coral formations began to pulse with inner light. Deep-dwelling creatures stirred from ancient lairs, called by the crown's authority. The very currents seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her command. "First," she said, her mental voice carrying to every creature within leagues, "let me show you how to dance with storms." The Leviathan's laughter shook the ruins. "Now you begin to understand. The coral crown doesn't just grant authority, it teaches responsibility. The power to command comes with the wisdom to know when and how to use that power." Astrid felt the truth of those words in every fibre of her transformed being. She was no longer simply a warrior who had been sacrificed to the sea. She had become something else, something that could bridge worlds and resurrect ancient partnerships. The coral crown was not just a symbol of authority over sea creatures. It was a reminder of the obligations that came with such power. "Gather them," she commanded, her thoughts carrying through the depths with the force of tidal waves. "Gather all who remember the old ways, all who swim in deeper waters, all who have waited centuries for the songs to be sung again." Around her the ruins blazed with living light as coral and current responded to her call. The time of mere survival was over. Now would come the time of transformation, of teaching those above that the deep was not something to be feared or appeased, but something to be understood and partnered with. The storm above grew stronger, but now it danced to her will rather than random fury. Soon, both friend and foe would learn what it meant when sacrifice led not to death, but to rebirth. When ancient powers found not victims, but partners. The coral crown pulsed with power, its light reaching toward the surface like fingers of dawn through darkness. The lesson was about to begin. Harold Blackbeard stood at the helm of his flagship, the chieftain's crown weighing heavier with each passing hour. Before him, resting on a cloth of faded crimson, lay the storm-glass compass, an artifact as old as the fleet itself. Unlike ordinary compasses that pointed north, this one was said to point toward destiny. Now its crystal face swirled with strange patterns, its needle spinning in impossible directions before stopping to point straight down into the depths. 6 hours since we gave her to the sea," Eric Redax muttered, his voice heavy with regret. "The storms still rage, and now this." He gestured to the horizon where dark sails had been spotted, the enemy fleet approaching through the gloom. Sigrid the seer hunched over the compass, her blind eyes somehow following the movement of its liquid interior. "She is not dead," the old woman announced with absolute certainty. "The glass shows transformation, not ending. See how the storms have changed?" Indeed, the natural chaos of the tempest had shifted into something almost rhythmic. Waves crashed against their hulls in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, while lightning danced in spirals rather than random bolts. Even the wind had taken on a strange musicality, whistling through the rigging in ways that made the crew cross themselves and mutter prayers to gods old and new. The storm-glass compass's needle suddenly spun wildly, its crystal face blazing. With inner light, deep beneath the waves, something vast moved, its passage marked by a trail of luminescence that shouldn't have been visible at this depth. "The enemy draws closer," Harold growled, gripping the ship's rail. 24 ships at least, thinking us weakened by the storm. Without Astrid to lead our shield wall. He couldn't finish the thought. "Look!" A cry went up from the crow's nest. "The water, it's changing." The sea around their ships had begun to glow with an eerie light, colors shifting and swirling in patterns that mirrored the compass's face. The storm's rhythm grew stronger, more purposeful, as if nature itself was building toward some terrible crescendo. Sigrid cackled, her aged hands dancing over the compass's surface. "Oh, clever girl," she whispered. "Clever, clever girl. You didn't just survive, did you? You learned their songs." The compass's needle began to spin in a perfect circle, while its crystal face showed images that should have been impossible. Vast shapes moving through deeper waters, ancient ruins glowing with coral light, and a figure that might have been Astrid, but was somehow more than human now. "My lord!" The lookout's voice cracked with fear. "The enemy fleet, they're changing course, moving faster than they should be able to in these waters, as if something's pulling them." Harold exchanged glances with Eric, both warriors recognizing the implications. Whatever power now moved through these waters, it was about to reveal itself. The storm-glass compass's spinning grew more intense, its crystal face blazing so bright it hurt to look at directly. "She always was different," Eric said softly, remembering the young warrior who had turned the tide of battle with nothing but a broken horn. "Never quite fitted into the world we thought we understood." Sigrid rose suddenly, her blind eyes wide. "The old powers wake," she intoned, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the storm itself. "Not appeased, but answered. Not conquered, but partnered. She has done what none have managed in 10 generations. She has learned their tongue, their ways, their truth." The compass's needle stopped abruptly, pointing toward the approaching enemy fleet. Its crystal face showed new images. Ships being dragged under by forces too vast to comprehend, ancient creatures rising from the depths, and through it all, a figure crowned in living coral, commanding the very sea itself. "Prepare for battle," Harold's voice carried across the deck. "But not as we've fought before. Something comes that will change everything we thought we knew about war at sea." The crew scrambled to obey, though their movements were uncertain. The storm's rhythm had become impossible to ignore now, its pattern building towards something that made the storm-glass compass's crystal face pulse like a living heart. Eric Redax studied the compass's shifting images. "She's not just survived," he realized aloud. "She's coming back, but what has she become?" "Something necessary," Sigrid answered, her aged hands still moving across the compass's surface. "Something that bridges worlds too long separated. The old songs speak of such things, of those who went into the deep as sacrifices and returned. As partners to powers we'd forgotten how to speak with." The enemy fleet drew closer, their dark sails now clearly visible through the strange stormlight. They moved with unnatural speed, driven by currents they couldn't possibly understand. "We're leading them to their doom." "The compass shows true paths," Sigrid reminded them. "Not just directions, but destinies. And hers," the old woman smiled her knowing smile. "Hers was never meant to end in those depths, only to be transformed by them." Harold gripped the rail tighter as the sea began to churn with new purpose. The storm-glass compass's crystal face had turned the color of deep water at midnight, while its needle pointed unwavering toward whatever power now rose from below. "Hold fast," he commanded as the waves grew higher. "Hold fast and witness what comes when sacrifice leads not to ending, but to alliance." The storm's rhythm reached its peak, and in the compass's depths, images of ancient power and modern destiny swirled together like water and blood. Above and below, 2 worlds prepared to meet again after centuries of separation. And somewhere in the deep, a warrior who had gone into the sea in chains, prepared to rise again with the power of the depths themselves at her command. The storm-glass compass blazed one final time, and the sea began to part. The tempest drums emerged first from the churning sea, ancient instruments larger than longships, carved from the bones of legendary creatures and wrapped in skin that shimmered like moonlight. On water, they rose on pillars of living coral, positioning themselves in a vast circle around the fleet. No human hands touched their surfaces, yet they began to beat with a rhythm that made the storm itself pause and listen. The enemy fleet faltered in their advance, their crews standing transfixed as the impossible drums played their ancient song. Each beat sent ripples through the water that glowed with inner light, creating patterns that matched the runes now burning on their ships' hulls, the same runes that had been carved into Astrid's sacrificial chains. "By all the gods," Eric, Redax whispered, his mighty axe trembling in his grip. "What magic is this?" Sigrid's answer was lost in a sound that shook the world, a note from the depths that made the tempest drums seem like children's toys. The Leviathan's head broke the surface first, rising higher than the tallest mast, water cascading from scales that gleamed with their own inner fire. But it was the figure standing upon its crown that drew every eye. Astrid stood transformed. The chains of her sacrifice, now a gleaming armor that shifted like liquid metal. The coral crown upon her brow pulsed with power, each beat matching the rhythm of the drums. At her throat, the storm-forged pendant blazed like a captured star, while in her hands she held both the scale of Jörmungandr and her broken war horn, now restored and wrapped in living coral. "Impossible," Harold breathed, the chieftain's crown slipping forgotten from his brow. "She rides the very serpent of the depths." The Leviathan's massive body continued to rise, coiling through the storm-tossed waves with impossible grace. Smaller sea creatures, if anything in these waters could be called small, emerged in its wake. Enormous sharks with patterns of bioluminescence. Along their flanks, squid whose tentacles wrapped around entire ships without crushing them. Whales whose songs harmonized with the tempest drums beating. Astrid raised the scale of Jörmungandr, and every drum fell silent. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that hadn't been heard in the surface world for centuries. "You sent me into the deepest sacrifice," she called, her words somehow clear despite the storm. "I return as partnership incarnate. The old powers never wanted death. They wanted understanding. They never sought victims. They sought those who could learn their songs." The enemy fleet tried to turn, to flee from the power now manifesting before them. But the waters themselves held them fast, currents directed by the drum's rhythm wrapping around their hulls like giant hands. "Your people once knew these truths," Astrid continued, her voice carrying to every ship, friend and foe alike. "You carved them into bones and wrote them in sagas. But you forgot. You thought the deep could be appeased with death when it only ever wanted dialogue." She lifted the broken war horn, now healed and transformed by coral growth. A single blast sent waves of visible sound through water and air, making the tempest drums vibrate in response. The Leviathan's massive head swayed to the rhythm, its ancient eyes fixed on the enemy fleet with terrible patience. "I offer you the same choice the depths offered me," Astrid declared. "Understanding or opposition, partnership or destruction. Choose quickly, for the old powers have waited long enough." From the enemy flagship a voice called out in desperation, "What are you?" Astrid smiled, and the coral crown flared with inner light. "I am what happens when sacrifice leads to transformation, when the deep finds not a victim but a student, when ancient powers find someone willing to learn their truth rather than impose their own." To demonstrate, she raised her hand. The tempest drums began to beat again, each impact visible as ripples of power through the water. The sea itself began to dance, waves rising and falling in perfect rhythm, creating patterns that spoke of powers older than human memory. The Leviathan's massive body moved through these waves like a dancer, its scales reflecting the drum's power in cascades of living light. Smaller creatures performed their own intricate movements, weaving between ships with precision that spoke of intelligent direction rather than mindless force. "Last chance," Astrid called, her voice harmonizing with the drum's beating. "Choose. Partnership with the powers you've forgotten, or face them in their full awakening." The enemy admiral's response was to loose a flight of arrows. They never reached their target. The tempest drum's rhythm changed, and a wall of water rose to catch the missiles, transforming them into schools of silver fish that swam back to their ships in perfect formation. "So be it," Astrid said softly, though her voice still carried to every ear. "Let me show you what the deep can do when properly understood." She raised the scale of Jörmungandr high, its surface catching the strange stormlight. The tempest drum's rhythm built to a crescendo, each beat now carrying enough force to make the very air vibrate. The Leviathan's massive body began to move with deliberate purpose, while countless smaller creatures took up positions around the enemy fleet. Through it all, Astrid stood transformed and terrible, the coral crown's light matching the rhythm of the drums, the chains of her sacrifice now instruments of power rather than bondage. She had gone into the deep as her people's offering and returned as something that bridged worlds too long separated. The drums began their war song, and the sea itself rose to dance. From the depths of the Leviathan's treasury, Astrid had drawn forth the Kraken's horn, a spiral construct of darkness and iridescence that seemed to bend light around its surface. Unlike her transformed war horn, this artifact had never been made by human hands. It had grown in the lightless trenches where the oldest creatures slumbered, shaped by pressures that would crush a longship to splinters. Now she raised it to her lips, while the tempest drums built a foundation of power beneath its call. The sound that emerged was like nothing the surface world had heard in 1,000 years, a complex harmony of whale song and storm fury, of ancient powers and deeper magics. The enemy fleet's initial shock had hardened into desperate determination. Their admiral was no fool. He could see the power arrayed against him, but chose to trust in numbers and human ingenuity. Ships began to form into battle lines, archers knocking arrows while spearmen lined the rails. "Brave," Astrid murmured, "but ultimately futile." She turned to the massive eye of the Leviathan beside her. "Shall we show them why the deep was never meant to be conquered?" The creature's approval rumbled through the water like distant thunder. Around them, the sea began to move with deliberate purpose. The Kraken's horn pulsed in Astrid's grip, its surface rippling like disturbed water as it called to its namesake's kin. First came the tentacles, dozens of them, each thick as a warrior's torso, rising from the depths with terrible precision. They wrapped around the enemy ship's hulls, not crushing, but holding them in place with irresistible strength. Panic spread through the enemy ranks as they realized their vessels were now little more than floating prisons. "You still think in terms of surface warfare," Astrid called, her voice carried by the tempest drum's rhythm. "You see only what floats above. Let me show you the true nature of power in these waters." The Kraken's horn sang again, a different note that made the coral formations on her armor pulse with answering light. From below, vast shapes began to rise, ancient creatures that had lived in these waters since before humans first dared to sail them. Their bodies created currents that rocked even the largest ships like toys, while their movements followed patterns that spoke of intelligence rather than mere instinct. An enemy captain, either braver or more foolish than his peers, ordered his archers to loose. Arrows arced toward Astrid in a deadly cloud, only to stop mid-flight as she raised the scale of Jörmungandr. The missiles hung suspended for a moment before transforming into silvery fish that swam back toward their ships in perfect formation. "The old powers don't need weapons of wood and iron," she declared. "They command life itself." To demonstrate, she sounded the Kraken's horn once more. Schools of fish rose from the depths in their thousands, moving with such coordinated purpose that they formed images in the water. Giant warriors made of living silver, sea serpents comprised of countless, smaller bodies moving as one. The enemy admiral finally found his voice. "What do you want?" he shouted across the waves. "Name your price." "Price?" Astrid laughed, and the sound carried harmonics that made the very water vibrate. "I'm not here to negotiate tribute. I'm here to teach a lesson about the true nature of power in these waters." She raised her hand, and the tentacles holding the enemy ships began to move, not to destroy, but to demonstrate complete control. Ships were lifted and turned, their crews holding on desperately as their vessels were repositioned like pieces on a game board. "For centuries, you've sailed these waters, thinking them a realm to be conquered," she called. "You've forgotten that the sea itself is alive, that it houses powers older than human memory. Today, you remember? The Kraken's horn sang again, and now the true Leviathan began to move. Its massive body created currents that could have swamped the entire enemy fleet. Instead, it wove between their ships with impossible grace, its scales brushing against their hulls with just enough force to demonstrate its terrible restraint. "Look well," Astrid commanded. "See what true power looks like? Not dominance through force, but authority through understanding." To punctuate her words, she raised both the horn and the scale. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath as surface and depths aligned in perfect harmony. Then, with a sound like the world's ending, the Leviathan breached fully, its entire vast body rising from the water in a display that shattered every human conception of what was possible. Water cascaded from its scales in patterns that matched the tempest drum's rhythm, while bioluminescent creatures swam through the falling curtains to create pictures in light and motion. The display spoke of power beyond human comprehension, of natural forces that could destroy fleets with a thought, but chose instead to demonstrate beauty. When the Leviathan subsided back into the sea, it created waves that should have swamped every ship in sight. Instead, the water moved with deliberate precision, rocking the vessels firmly but harmlessly. The message was clear. Everything that happened here was by choice, not chance. "Now," Astrid said into the stunned silence that followed, "shall we discuss the true purpose of power in these waters, or do you need another demonstration?" The enemy admiral's response was to lower his sword and bow deeply toward her position atop the Leviathan's head. One by one, his captains followed suit. They had come expecting to find a weakened fleet, easy prey for their ambitions. Instead, they had found something out of legend, a power that made their weapons and tactics seem like children's games. The Kraken's horn hummed softly in Astrid's grip, its surface reflecting the strange lights that still played through the water. She had shown them power beyond their imagining, demonstrated control that made their greatest feats of seamanship look clumsy. But this was just the beginning. "Your ships will be released," she declared, "but you sail home with new knowledge. The deep is not your enemy to conquer, nor your resource to plunder. It is your partner to understand, if you have the wisdom to learn its songs." As if to emphasize her words, the tentacles holding the enemy ships began to withdraw, each movement precisely controlled. The Leviathan's massive head lowered until its ancient eye was level with the enemy flagship's deck, giving them a clear view of its terrible intelligence. The message was clear. They were being allowed to leave, but the sea would never again be simply water to be sailed upon. They had witnessed the awakening of older powers, the return of ancient partnerships. Whatever happened next would depend on how well they learned this lesson. In the underwater temple's heart, Astrid held the mermaid's mirror before her, its surface not glass or polished metal, but living water somehow held in perfect stillness. Within its depths, images shifted and flowed, possible futures threading their way through the currents of time like schools of silvery fish. The mirror shows what might be. The Leviathan's thoughts resonated through the scale of Jörmungandr. But more importantly, it shows the connections between all things that swim or sail these waters. The mirror's surface rippled, revealing vast networks of sea life, from the smallest plankton to the greatest whales, all connected by currents of power older than human memory. Astrid watched as patterns emerged, migration routes that followed, ley lines of ancient magic, hunting grounds that pulsed with gathered power, deeper trenches where things that had never seen sunlight maintained their own ancient courts. "They're all aware," she realized, watching creatures she had once thought mindless move in complex social patterns. Every one of them has its own song, its own story. "Now you begin to understand," the Leviathan approved. "This is why mere force could never truly master the seas. One must understand the songs of all to command any." Through the mirror's surface, Astrid watched great whales teaching their young the songs that could guide ships through storm-wrapped waters. She saw sharks moving in patterns that maintained balances older than human civilization. Even the smallest, Fish played their parts in vast, living tapestries of power and purpose. The coral crown atop her brow hummed in harmony with these revelations, each new understanding adding to its growing constellation of lights. The chains that had once bound her, now transformed into armor of living metal, shifted and flowed as she learned more about the true nature of sea power. "Show me," she commanded the mirror. "Show me how to gather them all." The mirror's surface blazed with new images, ways of combining the kraken's horn's call with the tempest drum's rhythm, patterns of light and sound that could summon creatures from the deepest trenches, harmonies that could unite different species in common purpose. Astrid began to sing, her voice carrying harmonics learned from whale song and deeper music. Around her, the underwater ruins came alive with answering power. Coral formations pulsed with inner light while ancient statues shifted, revealing themselves as not stone but dormant sea life waiting for the proper song to wake them. "They come," the Leviathan observed as shapes began to emerge from the darkness. "They remember when humans knew their songs." Great sharks circled the temple, their patterns of bioluminescence creating scripts of light and shadow. Pods of whales moved through deeper waters, their songs harmonizing with Astrid's voice in ways that made the very ocean vibrate with power. From darker depths came stranger creatures, things that had slumbered since the first ships dared these waters, now stirring at the call of one who finally spoke their language. The mermaid's mirror showed each arrival, each new addition to this growing army of sea life. But more importantly, it showed the connections between them all, the ancient bonds of power and purpose that had always existed, waiting only for someone who could see and understand them. This is true sea power, Astrid realized watching. The mirror's display, not forcing creatures to obey, but understanding how they already work together, how they've always worked together. She saw now why the old partnerships had failed. Humans had tried to impose their will on the sea rather than learning its own natural patterns of power. They had sought to command rather than comprehend, to dominate rather than dance with the deeper currents of possibility. The mirror's surface shifted again, showing her own transformation. She watched as the sacrifice meant to end her life instead began a new kind of existence, one that bridged the gap between human understanding and sea power. The chains of her sacrifice had become connections to deeper truths, while the crown she wore pulsed with the combined songs of all sea life. "The enemy fleet was just the beginning," she said, watching new possibilities unfold in the mirror's depths. "There are more who need to learn these lessons, more who need to understand the true nature of power in these waters." The Leviathan's approval rumbled through the ancient temple. "And now you have the means to teach them, not through destruction, but through demonstration, not through fear, but through understanding." Astrid raised her hand, and creatures of all sizes and species moved in response, not as servants obeying commands, but as partners dancing to the same deep music. The mirror showed her what they could become together, a force not for conquest, but for protection, not for dominance, but for balance. "Gather them all," she commanded, her voice carrying harmonics that made the water itself sing. "Every creature that swims these seas, every being that remembers the old partnerships. It's time to remind the surface world why their ancestors worked with the deep rather than against it." The mirror's surface blazed one final time, showing her the path ahead, not just one possible future, but many, all flowing together like currents in the deep. In each one, she saw the same truth. The sea had never needed to be conquered. It had only waited for someone who could learn its songs, understand its patterns, and restore the partnerships that should never have been forgotten. As if in response to this understanding, the mirror's surface suddenly stilled, becoming a perfect reflection of what she had become. No longer simply a warrior cast into the deep, but something that bridged worlds too long separated. The coral crown she wore now pulsed with the combined light of countless sea creatures, while the transformed chains of her sacrifice had become a living armor that connected her to every current and creature in these waters. Around her, the gathered sea life moved in patterns that spoke of ancient power and new purpose. They were ready to show the surface world that true strength came not from domination, but from understanding. Not from breaking the sea's will, but from learning to dance with its deeper currents. The wave walker's boots materialized around Astrid's feet as she stepped from the Leviathan's head onto the surface of the storm-tossed sea. They seemed formed from water itself, constantly flowing yet somehow solid, allowing her to stand upon the waves as if they were sun-hardened earth. Beneath her feet, the ocean's surface rippled with each step, sending patterns of power spreading outward like ripples in a pool. 100 enemy ships approached through the gloom, a combined fleet gathered by those who refused to believe the tales of her transformation. They came armed with heavy iron chains to drag the Leviathan down, with blessed weapons their priests claimed could pierce sea magic, with nets woven from the hair of drowned maidens. They came prepared for every legend they knew. They weren't prepared for what she had become. Last warning. Astrid's voice carried across the waters, harmonizing with the tempest drum's endless rhythm. Turn back, or learn why the deep was never meant to be challenged. Their answer came in a hail of arrows and thrown spears. Astrid smiled, the coral crown flaring with inner light as she began to dance. Each step of the wave walker's boots sent new patterns racing through the water, living mandalas of power that transformed the sea itself into her partner. The incoming missiles never reached their targets. Walls of water rose with liquid grace, catching arrows and spears alike, transforming them into schools of silver fish that swam back toward the enemy fleet in perfect formation. The boot's power. Let her move across the waves like a skater on winter ice, each step precise and purposeful. "You bring iron and steel," she called as she danced. "Let me show you what the sea's weapons can do." The kraken's horn sang out, its call harmonizing with her movements. From the depths, vast shapes began to rise, not just the great serpent that had taught her the sea's ways, but dozens of its kin, smaller but no less terrible. They moved through the waters with deliberate grace, their scales reflecting the strange stormlight in cascades of living color. Enemy captains shouted orders, trying to maintain formation as the sea itself seemed to come alive around them. Great tentacles rose from the depths, not to crush their ships, but to hold them in place. A terrible demonstration of restraint that spoke of intelligence rather than mere force. Astrid's dance continued, the wave walker's boots leaving trails of phosphorescent light with each step. She moved between the enemy ships as if they were partners in some vast pattern, her transformed sacrifice chains flowing around her like liquid metal. Where she passed, the sea responded, waves rising and falling in perfect rhythm, currents shifting to her will. The first ship to break formation tried to ram her. Astrid spun aside with liquid grace, the boots carrying her up a wall of water that shouldn't have been able to hold her weight. As the ship passed beneath, she touched its hull with one hand. Coral began to grow at her touch, spreading across the wood in patterns that matched the runes on her armor. "The sea remembers," she called to its crew as she danced across their deck, the boots leaving trails of light with each step. "It remembers." When ships sailed with its blessing rather than against its will, more vessels moved to surround her, thinking to trap her between their hulls. They didn't understand that the sea itself was now her ally. The wave walker's boots pulsed with power as she stepped from wave to wave, while beneath the surface, her gathered sea creatures moved in patterns that matched her dance. The battle became a demonstration of power that the northern waters had not seen in 1,000 years. Astrid moved like water given purpose, the boots carrying her wherever she willed. Ships found themselves gently but irresistibly repositioned by currents that shouldn't have existed. Weapons turned to fish or coral at her touch, while the very waves themselves seemed to dance to the rhythm of her steps. Through it all, she never struck a killing blow. This wasn't about destruction, it was about education. Every movement of the wave walker's boots sent new lessons rippling through the water, lessons about the true nature of sea power, about the difference between domination and dance, between conquest and cooperation. The enemy fleet's formation gradually dissolved, not through destruction, but through demonstration. One by one, their captains came to understand that they faced something beyond their experience or capability. This was not a force that could be defeated by human weapons or tactics. This was the sea itself, awakened and given purpose. When the last ship finally lowered its sails in surrender, Astrid stood upon the waves before them, the wave-walker's boots pulsing with quiet power. Around her, the gathered creatures of the deep moved in patterns that spoke of ancient authority and new understanding. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what lesson she would teach next. "Remember this day," she commanded, her voice carrying harmonics, learned from whale song and deeper music. "Remember what true power looks like in these waters. Not force, but understanding. Not conquest, but partnership." As if to emphasize her words, she began one final dance. The wave-walker's boots left trails of light that formed images on the water's surface, scenes from the deep that no human eye had witnessed in centuries. The gathered ships watched in awe as the sea itself became a living story, telling tales of ancient partnerships and future possibilities. The storm above gradually calmed, its fury transformed into something more purposeful. The waves that had threatened to swamp ships now moved in patterns that matched the tempest drum's rhythm. Even the wind seemed to dance to the beat of Astrid's steps, carrying the scent of deeper waters and older magics. In the depths of her underwater sanctuary, Astrid studied the blood coral growing along her transformed chains, living formations that pulsed with a deep crimson light marking the price of power. Each branch had grown from a moment of choice. Each crystalline structure contained memories of decisions that could never be undone. They were beautiful, but their beauty came with weight. The deep changes all who truly understand it. The Leviathan's thoughts resonated through the scale of Jörmungandr. Power is not simply claimed. It must be earned again and again with every choice made. Astrid touched one of the coral branches, watching as it flickered with memories. The face of every sailor who now looked at her with fear rather than fellowship, the way her former companions stepped back when she approached, the whispered prayers when she walked on water. She was no longer simply their warrior or leader. She had become something else, something that bridged worlds, but perhaps belonged fully to neither. "They fear me now," she said softly, watching the blood coral pulse with her words. "Even those I fought beside, those I sought to protect." Fear and awe often walked together," the ancient creature replied. "You knew there would be a price for understanding the deep songs. Did you think that price would only be physical?" The coral structures grew as she watched, adding new branches that captured her reflection, not as she had been, but as she had become. The coral crown's light played across surfaces that showed her transformed nature, eyes that held depths that hadn't been there before, skin that sometimes seemed to shimmer with patterns like light through water, movements that had become too fluid to be entirely human. "I chose this," she reminded herself, though the blood coral pulsed darker at her words. "I chose to learn the deep's ways rather than simply die as sacrifice. And now you must choose how to bear the weight of that choice," the Leviathan observed. "Power to command the seas comes with responsibility to understand their nature. The blood coral grows not to remind you of what you've lost, but of what you've gained, and what that gaining costs." Around them, the ruins of the ancient underwater. Cities seemed to shift and change, responding to her emotions. Coral formations grew and reshaped themselves, creating patterns that reflected the complexity of her position. She had become a bridge between worlds, but bridges must be anchored on both shores or risk collapse. The blood coral suddenly flared, with new light, showing her visions of possible futures, paths where the power she wielded led to isolation, where the very forces she had learned to command became walls between her and her own kind. But it also showed other possibilities, ways to use her understanding, to rebuild connections rather than sever them, to teach rather than simply command. The price of power isn't just in what it takes from you, she realized, watching the coral's shifting displays. It's in how you choose to use what it gives you. The Leviathan's approval rumbled through the water. The blood coral responded by growing new formations, these ones showing scenes of balance rather than separation. Humans learning to work with the sea's forces rather than against them. Ships sailing in harmony with deeper currents. Ancient partnerships renewed through understanding rather than force. Every power demands its price, the creature reminded her, but you choose how to pay it. Whether to let it isolate you in greatness or use it to build bridges of understanding. Astrid stood, her transformed chains flowing around her like liquid memory. The blood coral pulsed with her movement, its light neither entirely beautiful nor entirely terrible. Much like the power she now wielded, she had become something new, something that walked the boundary between human and legend. The price of that transformation would always be with her growing like the coral itself, marking every choice and consequence. But perhaps that was as it should be. Perhaps the weight of power should be visible, should be carried where all could see it. The blood coral would continue to grow, recording her journey, marking the cost of every decision. But it would also light the way forward, showing paths through deeper waters and darker choices. She was no longer simply the warrior who had been sacrificed to the sea. She had become something else, something that bore the price of power in living coral and transformed chains, in eyes that held depths and movements that spoke of tides. The cost was high, but so too was the possibility of what she could accomplish with such power properly understood. The blood coral flared one final time, its light reflecting off the ruins around them like memories of futures yet to come. The price would continue to grow, but so too would her understanding of how to bear it. That perhaps was the deepest lesson the sea had to teach, that true power lay not in avoiding its cost, but in choosing how to carry its weight. Destinies. Map unfurled across the ancient temple's floor, its surface neither parchment nor cloth, but living water somehow held in perfect form. Currents moved across it like ink, drawing and redrawing the boundaries between sea and shore, between human understanding and deeper truths. Unlike ordinary maps that showed only physical geography, this one revealed the flowing lines of power that connected all things in these waters. Harold Blackbeard knelt beside it, his weathered hand hovering just above its surface. It was the first time he had dared to enter Astrid's underwater sanctuary, brought down in a bubble of power maintained by her new abilities. The former chieftain looked both awed and uncertain, watching as paths of possibility wrote themselves across the map's living surface. The old alliances are awakening, Astrid explained, the coral crown pulsing softly as she spoke, not just between humans and sea creatures, but between all who share these waters. The map shows us how to rebuild what was lost. Lines of light trace new routes across the map's surface, safe passages through waters once thought treacherous, feeding grounds that could sustain both human settlements and sea life, places where the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for understanding to flow both ways. We were wrong, Harold admitted, watching the patterns shift. For generations, we thought power meant controlling the sea. We never considered that it might mean learning to dance with it instead. The map's surface rippled, showing scenes from possible futures. Ships guided by whale song through storm-wracked waters, settlements that worked in harmony with tide. And current, ancient partnerships renewed through understanding rather than force. Each vision was clear but fluid, suggesting possibilities rather than fixed destinies. The path forward isn't about erasing boundaries, Astrid said, watching the map's display. It's about learning to cross them properly, about understanding that power flows both ways across such borders. The map pulsed with her words, showing new alliances forming like coral growing in accelerated time. The future it revealed wasn't one of simple harmony. There would always be storms and challenges, but it was one where understanding flowed more freely between surface and depth. Harold stood, his decision visible in the straightening of his spine. "Tell us what you need," he said simply. "How do we begin?" The map's surface shifted one final time, showing the first steps of a journey that would transform not just their people, but their understanding of what power truly meant in these waters. It was time to build something new, something that bridged worlds too long separated by fear and misunderstanding. The god's tear hung suspended between Astrid's palms, a gem the size of a child's fist that seemed to contain an entire ocean within its crystalline depths. Sometimes it burned with the fury of storm-tossed seas. Other times it held the perfect stillness of deep waters. The ancient artifact had been brought to her by creatures from the darkest trenches, a tool of power that could either calm the waters or raise them to devastating fury. She would need both aspects now. On the horizon, black sails approached, hundreds of them belonging to a fleet that refused all offers of partnership. They came bearing weapons forged specifically to fight sea magic, led by those who believed the old ways could only be destroyed, never understood. "They think to challenge the deep itself," the Leviathan rumbled beside her. "They have not learned from the other's failure." Astrid watched the god's tear pulse with growing power. Within its facets, she could see the approaching battle from all angles, above the waves and below them, from the perspective of birds wheeling overhead and creatures swimming in the depths. The gem didn't just control the sea's power, it helped its wielder understand the true nature of conflict in these waters. "Some lessons," she said softly, "must be taught with storm and steel." The tear flared at her words, its light matching the rhythm of the tempest drums that had begun to beat their battle song. "But even in war, we can teach understanding rather than simple destruction." She raised the gem high, and the sea began to rise with it. The final battle for the soul of these waters was about to begin. The crown of the sea materialized above the waters, a circlet of pure power formed from the combined energies of storm and deep, of ancient magics and older partnerships. It hung suspended between sea and sky, its light outshining even the god's tear's radiance. This was no mere symbol of authority, but the physical manifestation of the ocean's true power, formed only in moments when surface and depths achieved perfect harmony. As Astrid rose through the waves to meet it, everything else seemed to pause. The approaching enemy fleet, the creatures of the deep, even the storm itself held its breath. The transformed chains of her sacrifice floated around her like strands of liquid starlight, while the coral crown she had worn until now dissolved into pure energy, ready to merge with this greater power. "Choose," the Leviathan's voice echoed through the waters. "Choose. Not just power, but how to use it." The enemy fleet had halted, their crews standing transfixed as Astrid hung suspended between sea and sky. They had come expecting to fight a warrior who commanded sea creatures. Instead, they faced the sea, itself given purpose and consciousness. The crown of the sea descended slowly, its power building like the moment before lightning strikes. This was the culmination of everything. Sacrifice transformed into strength, chains into connections, death into rebirth. As it settled onto her brow, sea and sky became one, and Astrid understood at last the true meaning of power in these waters. She had become not ruler of the sea, but its voice, not its conqueror, but its translator. And now, at last, she would show what that truly meant. The peace shell rose from the calming waters, its spiral form catching the first rays of dawn. Unlike ordinary shells, this one seemed to be made of living mother of pearl, its surface shifting with colors that spoke of both sea and sky. It floated between Astrid and the surviving ships of the enemy fleet, its presence somehow both humble and profound. The crown of the sea still blazed upon her brow, but its light had softened from the terrible radiance of battle to something more akin to morning on still waters. The enemy fleet's weapons, their specially forged chains, their Blessed blades, their enchanted nets, had all been transformed into coral reefs that would now serve as sanctuaries for sea life. Not every victory requires destruction, Astrid spoke, her voice carrying harmonics of whale song and deeper music. The peace shell shows us another way. The shell began to sing, not with sound, but with pure understanding that flowed between all present. In its song, humans and sea creatures alike saw visions of what could be. Ships guided safely through storms, abundant fishing grounds maintained through cooperation rather than competition, ancient partnerships renewed through wisdom rather than force. The battle was over. The real work of transformation could begin. The story stone stood taller than 3 men, its surface a living matrix of coral and crystal that caught both sunlight and sea shine. Astrid pressed her palm against it, watching as images spread from her touch, not carved or painted, but alive within the stone itself. The crown of the sea pulsed softly on her brow as she fed the memories into this final artifact, ensuring that future generations would understand not just what had happened, but why. They would see a shieldmaiden bound in chains of sacrifice, transforming bonds into bridges. They would witness the Leviathan's lessons and the deep's ancient truths. They would understand how power could flow both ways across the boundaries. Between worlds, how partnership proves stronger than dominion. Let them see all of it, she commanded, and the stone responded. It showed the price paid in blood coral, the wisdom gained from the mermaid's mirror, the paths revealed by destiny's map. It captured the music of the tempest drums and the call of the kraken's horn. Most importantly, it preserved the understanding that had made it all possible, that the sea was never meant to be conquered, only comprehended. The story stone would stand at the border of sea and shore, accessible to both realms. Ships would anchor here to learn its lessons, while sea creatures would gather to renew the ancient contracts. Some would see only the surface tale of a sacrifice transformed, but others would understand the deeper truth, that power came not from breaking the sea's will, but from learning to dance with its tides. Astrid stepped back, watching the stone, pulse within a light. She had become something new, not quite human anymore, but not entirely of the deep either. She was the bridge, the translator, the living proof that understanding could transform chains into crowns. The Leviathan's massive form surfaced beside the stone, its ancient eyes reflecting both approval and anticipation. The tale is told. It rumbled, but the story continues. As it should, Astrid agreed, feeling the currents of both water and power flow around her. Every ending is just another beginning, seen from a different tide. Above them wheeled seabirds, below them swam creatures of the deep, and all around them flowed the endless waters that had taught her the true meaning of power. The story stone would preserve this moment, this understanding, this transformation. But the real legacy would live on, in every ship that sailed these waters, in every creature that swam its depths, in every soul that learned to listen to the sea's deeper songs. The old sacrificial chains had become bonds of partnership, and the crown of the sea was not a burden, but a bridge. Whatever came next, the waters would remember, and so would all who learned to read the story stone's living tales.